The broth was almost ready. Julian could tell by the smell, that specific shift when venison's stock stops being raw and starts being something worth eating. He crouched over the copper pot and stirred slowly, watching the dark surface break into small, lazy circles. The fire underneath was modest, built low against the wind, ringed with flat stones he'd spent 20 minutes arranging. Old habit. A cook's habit. Fire management is half the meal. The howling tundra didn't care about his habits. The wind had been pushing from the north all afternoon, carrying a cold that didn't just chill, it pressed. It leaned against his coat like a hand trying to get through a door. Julian's face had stopped hurting an hour ago, which was the part he didn't like. Numb was worse than pain. Numb meant you stopped tracking damage. He pulled the collar of his oilskin higher and kept stirring, and tried not to think about how far the next windbreak was. 3 days, maybe 4. He'd crossed worse. That was the thing he told himself when the numbers stopped making sense. The skillet sat beside the fire, propped at an angle against the rock ring. He kept it there out of pure instinct, the same way a carpenter keeps a hammer within reach even when he's not building anything. Julian had carried that skillet for 6 years, through 11 different employers and 2 kingdoms, and one very poorly planned mountain crossing that he didn't talk about anymore. The handle was wrapped in cord where the original grip had cracked. The base was discolored from years of direct flame. It was the ugliest piece of cookware in any room it had ever been in, and he trusted it completely. He was reaching for the small paper pouch of dried thyme when he heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a change in the texture of sound. The wind had a rhythm out here, a long, low oscillation that you stopped hearing consciously after the first few hours, the same way you stop hearing your own breathing. What Julian heard was something cutting across that rhythm, a drag, intermittent, low, heavy, metal on stone. He didn't stand up immediately. He tilted his head and listened. The drag came again, closer, slow, effortful. Whatever was making that sound was spending something to move. Julian set the thyme pouch down and reached to the side, picking up the iron skillet from its lean. Not as a weapon, not consciously. He just picked it up. His hand knew things his brain was still working out. He stood and turned toward the whiteout. The blizzard wall sat about 30 meters back from his camp, a moving curtain of white that swallowed the horizon whole. He'd built far enough from it to give himself warning time, another old habit from years cooking for hunting parties in bad weather. You never made camp inside the weather. You made camp at its edge, where you could see it coming. But what was coming now wasn't weather. The shadow appeared low in the white. It moved wrong. It moved the way injured animals moved, not fast, not upright. Progress bought in increments. Julian's fire threw uneven orange light that barely reached the edge of the whiteout, but it reached far enough to catch the shape of a figure on hands and one knee, dragging itself forward through the snow. Large. Much larger than a person had any business being. One arm extended, fingers raking a groove through the surface. The other arm trailing something behind it, something that caught on the ice and held and had to be wrenched loose with every pull. Julian stepped to the side of his fire, not away from it. He wasn't going to give up his light. He kept the skillet low at his side and watched the figure crawl into the reach of the flame. She was enormous. That registered first, before anything else. The sheer scale of her, even flattened against the ground, even wasted down to sinew. She wore armor in pieces, boiled leather over a frame built for a different kind of fight than whatever had put her in the snow. The breastplate was cracked along the sternum. The left pauldron was gone entirely. Her skin, where it showed at the neck and wrists, was gray-green and rimed white, frost sitting in the pores like salt in cured meat, which meant she'd been out in this long enough for surface tissue to begin dying. The iron collar sat at the base of her throat. Not a collar in any decorative sense. A band of black iron, thick as Julian's wrist, with a ring weld that had been sealed, not locked. You didn't open it with a key. The chain ran from a second ring at the back of the collar, down her spine, and attached to the block dragging behind her. A cast-iron anvil, maybe 40 kilograms, scratching a dark furrow through the snowpack. The chain was heavy gauge. The links were old but intact. Someone had built this to last longer than she was supposed to. Julian understood what he was looking at. In the Empire's eastern territories, this was what they did with condemned warriors who'd broken oath. They didn't execute them cleanly. That would have been a mercy. They chained them to dead weight and left them in open weather and called it justice. The collar was designed to be unremovable without a forge. The weight was designed to slow flight. The tundra was designed to finish the job within 72 hours, usually faster. She had made it further than 72 hours. She stopped crawling when she reached the edge of firelight. Her head lifted and she looked at him. Her eyes were yellow, not the yellow of sickness, but the pale gold of orc battle lineage, the kind bred for the northern campaigns. One of them was crusted half shut with old blood from a cut above the brow. The other found the fire, found Julian, and didn't move. Julian didn't move either. The wind pushed between them, scattering sparks east. The copper pot bubbled once, quietly, and the smell of venison broth carried across the cold. Her cracked lips parted. She breathed out a long, controlled exhale that said she was still thinking, still calculating, still something more than an animal in the snow. Then she lowered her head and closed her eyes, and her arms shook, and she didn't fall only because she locked her elbow at the last second. Julian looked at the skillet in his hand. He looked at the fire. He looked at the pot. Then he set the skillet back against the rocks, crouched down, and picked up a wooden spoon. He didn't approach her fast. Julian moved the way he moved around nervous animals at a market, slowly, with his hands visible, keeping his weight low. He'd learned that from a horse trader in the South, who'd told him once that speed was the enemy of trust. You could be the most harmless person alive and still get kicked in the chest if you moved wrong. Julian had thought about that a lot over the years. It applied to more situations than horses. He stopped 2 meters away and crouched down to her level. Up close, the damage was worse. The frost on her skin wasn't just surface. It had settled into the creases of her knuckles, the corners of her mouth, the hollow beneath her jaw. Her breathing was shallow and too controlled. The kind of breathing you did when your body had stopped producing heat naturally and your mind was still trying to fake it. The leather armor had stiffened in the cold until it was closer to shell than clothing. Beneath the broken breastplate, her chest rose and fell in increments. Julian dipped the wooden spoon into the copper pot and brought it back full. The broth steamed in the cold air, the vapor curling sideways in the wind. He blew across it once, gently, the way you cooled food for someone who couldn't do it themselves, and held it out toward her. She didn't move. Her one open eye tracked the spoon. Not him, the spoon. The steam. The smell hit her a second later, and he watched something shift in her face. Not softening. More like recognition, the way a body responds to something it needs before the mind gives permission. Then she looked at him. Her cracked lips parted and her voice came out low and rough, scraped down to almost nothing by cold and disuse. "Poison," she said, "is warmer than ice." Julian held the spoon steady. "It's venison," he said. "Dried meat, melt water, 3 spices. The thyme is for flavor. The salt is for the cold." He paused. "There's no poison. I don't carry any." She stared at the spoon. The chain clinked once as her fingers shifted against the ground. "Why?" she said. It wasn't really a question. It was the word underneath the question, the one that meant, why would you? Why now? Why me? Why not just let the tundra finish what was started? Julian didn't have a clean answer for that. He'd asked himself the same thing in the 30 seconds between picking up the skillet and putting it back down. He didn't have a philosophy about it. He just knew that the broth was hot and she was cold, and the distance between those two facts was 1 wooden spoon. "Because it's ready," he said. "And you're here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened her mouth. He fed her slowly, not because she was weak. She was weak, but that wasn't why. He went slow because fast would have made it something else. Fast would have been efficiency. Slow made it a choice, repeated. Each spoonful was a small thing. He kept his eyes down, watching the broth, giving her something to look at other than his face. The fire crackled behind him. The wind pushed, pulled, pushed again. Her jaw had been locked rigid. He could see it in the way the tendons ran up her neck. The first swallow cracked something loose. The second made her exhale through her nose, a long, involuntary sound that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite pain. Her shoulders dropped 3 centimeters. Julian noticed and said nothing. He refilled the spoon, twice, 3 times. Her arms had given out entirely. She was sitting back on her heels now, chain pooled in the snow beside her, the anvil resting against the ice like it had always been there. She couldn't lift her hands. The fingers were too far gone for fine movement, the joints swollen and pale at the tips. Julian kept feeding her, and she kept accepting it, and neither of them talked, and the fire burned between them and the whiteout. By the 6th spoonful, her eye had cleared some. Not warm, not yet, but present. She was tracking him now, not just the spoon. He felt it, that shift from being watched as a threat to being watched as a person. And he didn't react to it, because reacting would have collapsed it. He scraped the bottom of the first portion and set the spoon across the rim of the pot. "More?" he asked. She said nothing, but she didn't look away. He took that as yes and filled the spoon again. When the bowl was empty, she sat in silence for a long time, the heat working through her from the inside. Julian settled back on his heels and pulled his coat tighter and watched the fire. The venison had been good. He'd salted it right, hadn't over-reduced the stock. Small satisfaction. He filed it away the way he filed all small satisfactions, quietly, without ceremony. She spoke without looking at him. "What are you doing?" she said. "Out here?" "Foraging," he said. "Tundra moss, mostly. Some frost root if the season's right." He paused. "I cook for myself now. Used to cook for other people." She turned her head and studied him with that one clear eye. Something moved across her face. Not contempt exactly, but close to it. The expression of someone recalibrating a threat assessment and finding the numbers smaller than expected. A man with spices. A man who cooked moss. Julian let her look. The fire popped and a log shifted, and the copper pot swayed slightly on its hook. Outside the ring of light, the blizzard moved in its slow, indifferent rotation, and the dark stayed dark, and the cold pressed against the edge of warmth, like it was waiting for an invitation. She hadn't asked him to help. She hadn't agreed to anything. But she was sitting upright now, and the frost on her jaw had begun to melt, and the chain between collar and anvil coiled in the snow between them, like a question neither of them had answered yet. The second bowl went down faster than the first. Not because she'd stopped being suspicious. Julian could see the suspicions still sitting in her, in the way she watched his hands whenever he moved, in the slight tension that ran back into her shoulders each time the wind shifted. It was reflex, not thought. The kind of wariness that gets built into muscle over years, not days. But her body had overruled it. Starvation does that. It strips the hierarchy down to one instruction, and everything else waits. He didn't try to fill the silence. He kept the fire stoked and the pot within reach, and let the broth do the talking. By the end of the second bowl, her fingers had started to move. Not much, a slow curl, an uneven flex, the joints protesting the returning circulation. She looked down at her hands as if they belonged to someone she'd heard about but never met. Her knuckles were split in several places, the cuts old and reopened, dark against the gray-green of her skin. The frost had retreated from her face. The color underneath wasn't healthy yet, but it was alive. Julian set the empty pot aside and wiped the spoon on his coat. "Your hands," he said, not a question. She looked up. "The tips are still white," he gestured toward her fingers. "You need to move them. Slowly. Don't rub them. Rubbing breaks tissue. Just flex. Open and close." She stared at him with an expression that said she'd received instructions from humans before, and those instructions had generally involved chains. Then she looked back at her hands and, after a long pause, began to open and close her fingers with the mechanical patience of someone completing a task they found beneath them. Julian turned to his pack and found the small tin of rendered tallow he kept for dry skin and leather maintenance. He uncapped it without commentary and held it out to her. She looked at the tin. She looked at him. He set it on the ground between them and moved back to the fire. She picked it up eventually. He didn't watch. The tallow helped. It always did in cold like this. He used it himself, on the backs of his own hands where the skin cracked worst. His knuckles looked like old saddle leather by midwinter. Occupational reality. Cold and salt and constant handling did that. And there was no elegant solution, just maintenance. You kept the damage from getting worse, and you worked around the rest. He fed more wood to the fire. Small pieces, added one at a time to build the bed without smothering it. Orc metabolism was the reason he'd doubled his portions. He'd treated enough large men and working animals to know that size and cold created a deficit that went beyond what it looked like from the outside. The body burned faster to maintain temperature, and when it ran out of fuel, it shut systems down in sequence. Extremities first, then cognition, then core. She'd been out there long enough that the sequence had already started. The broth had interrupted it, but interruption wasn't reversal. She needed more heat and more calories and time for both to work. He built the fire higher. She noticed. He saw it in the small pause in her hands, the brief stillness before she resumed flexing her fingers. She didn't say anything, but she shifted her weight slightly, moving a degree closer to the flame, and Julian counted that as progress. Her jaw had loosened entirely by now. The rigid set of the muscles beneath her ears had released, which he knew was a good sign because the jaw was one of the last places to thaw and one of the earliest to lock. She turned her head in a slow rotation, testing the range. Something in her neck cracked once, loudly, and she exhaled through her nose. "The collar," Julian said. He kept his voice even. Informational. "The seal weld. How old is it?" She was quiet for a moment. 7 days, she said. He looked at the iron band at her throat. 7 days in the tundra with that weight on her leg, meant she'd covered ground that most soldiers wouldn't have survived 3 days into. He didn't say that. She knew it better than he did. "I have a cold chisel," he said. "Not large enough for the collar, but the chain, the link closest to the anvil. If the iron's fatigued from the cold, there might be a fracture point." He paused. "You'd still have the chain, but you'd lose the weight." She turned and looked at the anvil sitting in the snow behind her. She looked at it the way you looked at something you'd stopped seeing because it had been there too long. Then she looked back at the fire. "After," she said. He nodded and didn't push it. The tallow tin came back across the ground toward him, pushed with 2 fingers. He picked it up and recapped it and put it in his pack. Her hands moved with more range now. Not full grip, not yet, but the white had retreated from the tips and the natural color of her skin had pushed back to the second knuckle. The cold had lost the argument for now. She shifted her weight and the chain rang against the stone ring of the fire pit. She looked down at it. Her expression didn't change, but something in it settled, like a door closing on a room she'd stopped using. She'd been carrying that anvil through 7 days of open tundra, and she was still here, and the broth was warm, and the fire was larger than it had been 10 minutes ago. Julian pulled the second tin from his pack, the chili oil, thick and dark, a small luxury he maintained on principle. He worked a few drops into the remaining broth and set it back over the heat. "Drink the rest," he said. "All of it." She looked at the pot. "You will eat." "I ate before you arrived," he said. It wasn't entirely true. He'd been about to, but it was close enough, and she needed it more than he did. He'd run a calorie deficit before. He knew how to manage it. She held his gaze for a moment with that pale gold eye, reading something in his face. Whatever she found, she didn't argue. She reached out and took the pot with both hands, the grip still unsteady but her own, and drank. The fire pushed its heat outward and the wind worked around the edges and found nothing to take. They left before first light. Julian's reasoning was practical. The blizzard had thinned overnight to a steady push rather than a wall, which meant visibility had opened to roughly 40 meters. That window wouldn't hold. The howling tundra cycled through its weather in unpredictable rotations, and 40 meters of clear air was a gift that didn't come with a schedule. He broke camp in the dark, working by touch and firelight, packing in the order he always packed, heaviest to the bottom, fragile to the center, tools at the top where he could reach them without unpacking everything. Balin watched him do it. She hadn't slept, or if she had, she'd done it in increments he hadn't caught. When he'd woken, she was already sitting upright, chain coiled in her lap, staring at the place where the fire had been. The embers were gray. She'd let it die down rather than feed it, which told him she'd understood, without being told, that they were moving. He'd worked the cold chisel for 40 minutes before dawn, crouched behind her at the link closest to the anvil. The iron had fatigued in the cold, the way he'd hoped. A hairline fracture running across the inner curve of the link, invisible until he pressed the chisel tip into it and felt it give. 3 strikes with the flat of the skillet handle, and the link sheared. The chain dropped free of the anvil with a sound like a sentence ending. She sat still for a long moment after. The chain itself remained, still running from her collar, still heavy, still trailing behind her when she stood. But the anvil stayed in the snow where it fell, and when she took her first step without it, she stumbled slightly. Not from weakness, but from the absence of a counterweight her body had memorized. Julian said nothing. He shouldered his pack and picked up his walking staff, a length of ash wood, thick enough to probe with and light enough to carry, and started north. She followed. The tundra in thin daylight was a different landscape than the tundra at night. At night it had texture and depth. Shadow gave it dimension. In the flat gray light of early morning, it flattened into a continuous white surface that the eye kept sliding off, unable to find purchase. The snowdrifts looked solid and were often not. The flat stretches between them looked thin and were often deeper than his knees. Julian had learned this the way he learned most tundra lessons, by going through the surface unexpectedly and spending 10 cold minutes extracting himself. He used the staff now, pressing it ahead into each step before committing his weight. The wood punched through drifts that looked walkable and skimmed across stretches that looked treacherous, and he read the resistance and adjusted his line and kept moving. It was slow. It was meant to be slow. Behind him, the chain dragged through the snow. It carved a trench as Balin walked, a deep, clean furrow that ran straight and consistent, wiping out his smaller prints entirely. He'd noticed this within the first 10 minutes and felt a quiet, practical relief. In open country, tracks were information. His boot prints were easy to read. Direction, pace, weight. The chain trench behind Balin erased them, leaving only the single wide groove that told a tracker almost nothing useful. He didn't mention it. She didn't either. But he suspected she'd noticed too. They moved in silence for the first hour. Julian tracked landmarks by instinct. A particular jag in the distant ridgeline, the angle of the wind against his left cheek, the slight magnetic pull he felt in the small compass he kept on a cord inside his coat. The geothermal springs were 4 days north-northeast. He'd heard of them from a cartographer in the last settlement who'd drawn the route in charcoal on a piece of cured skin and charged him 3 coins for the privilege. The map was in his breast pocket. He'd already memorized it. He kept the copy as backup. Balin's breathing behind him was even and heavy, a rhythm he could track without turning. She moved differently without the anvil. Longer strides, more upright, though the chain still swung at her ankle and caught on subsurface ice occasionally, jerking her mid-step. She compensated without breaking pace, absorbing the correction the way trained fighters absorbed unexpected terrain. Automatic. Practiced. He stopped at the midpoint of the second hour and pulled dried meat from his pack. He broke it in half and held the larger portion back over his shoulder without turning around. There was a pause. Then it left his hand. They chewed and walked. "The springs," she said, between one step and the next. Her voice had more texture in it now than the night before, still rough, but fuller, fed. 4 days, Julian said. She was quiet then. "You know this ground." "I know the map," he said. "Not the same thing." Another silence. The wind came from the left and pushed at his coat and passed. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the white, a loose sheet of surface ice shifted and groaned under its own tension. "The map is wrong," she said. Julian stopped. He turned and looked at her. She was reading the horizon, not looking at it the way he looked at it, with an eye trained on landmarks, but differently, lower. Her gaze tracked the surface, the way the snow lay, the direction small debris had blown and settled. She stood still with her head slightly angled, and he recognized the posture without being able to name it. Someone reading a language he didn't speak. "How wrong," he said. "The eastern pass," she lifted her chin north-northeast. "Collapsed. 2 winters back." She paused. "Avalanche." Julian pulled the map from his coat and looked at it. The cartographer had marked the eastern pass as the primary route. He looked at the horizon where Balin was looking. He looked back at the map. He folded it and put it back in his pocket. "Is there another way?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned slightly west of north and started walking. Julian adjusted his grip on the staff and followed. The western route Balin had chosen ran along a pressure ridge, a long spine of ice pushed up by competing glacial plates beneath the surface, high enough to give sightlines and solid enough to hold weight. Julian had to work to keep pace with her on the climb. His legs were shorter and the footing was uneven. Broken slabs tilted at angles that his boots kept slipping off. He used the staff constantly, jamming it into gaps for leverage. She climbed without apparent effort, the chain swinging from her collar in a slow arc, her hands finding holds on the ice face as if she'd mapped it before she touched it. They reached the spine as the light shifted from gray to a flat, directionless white that meant cloud cover thickening overhead. Julian checked the compass and noted their bearing and put it away. The wind up on the ridge was sharper than below. It found every gap in his coat and worked at them methodically. He pulled his scarf higher and breathed through the wool and tasted the cold in his teeth. She stopped 30 meters ahead of him and crouched very suddenly in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. Julian stopped walking. He didn't speak. He watched her, the stillness of her, the way her head angled slightly east toward a long snowbank that ran parallel to the ridge maybe 15 meters down the western slope. He looked at the snowbank. It looked like every other snowbank. Flat, unbroken surface, no tracks, no shadow beneath the crust. Then he noticed the shape of it. Too regular, too consistent in its curve, the way a drift built over something solid rather than piled by wind alone. He had time to register that observation, and nothing else before the troll came through the surface. It erupted upward in a burst of compacted snow, shedding the drift like a coat shrugged off in a doorway. It was large in the way that removed the word from usefulness, taller than Balin by a full head, built in dense, layered slabs, its body covered in plates of natural ice that had grown over its hide like bark over a wound. The ice armor wasn't decorative. It was structural, fused at the joints, thicker at the chest and shoulders, formed over seasons of exposure in temperatures that would kill most things that breathed. The troll opened its mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't a roar so much as a pressure, a sound Julian felt in his back teeth. And it sprayed ice crystals in a fan that stung his cheeks and made his eyes water instantly. He was already moving, not toward it, sideways, toward his pack, fingers finding the flap by memory while his eyes stayed on the troll. He knew exactly what he was reaching for because he'd inventoried his pack that morning in the dark, and the high-proof cooking spirits were in the outer left pocket, 2 glass bottles wrapped in cloth, both intact. He got his hand around the neck of the first bottle and pulled it free. Balin moved between him and the troll. She didn't run at it. She planted her right foot, gripped the chain at mid-length with both hands, and began to swing the loose end in a low arc at her side, building momentum in steady rotations. The chain was heavy-gauge iron, 2 meters of it, and the swinging end gained speed with each pass until it was moving faster than Julian could comfortably track. The troll took a step toward her, and she let it come, watching it with the focused patience of someone who had decided exactly when to act and was waiting for the geometry to align. Julian uncorked the bottle with his teeth and held it low, watching the fire. Their camp was broken. He had no open flame. His mind ran the problem in one sharp loop and landed on the tinderbox in his coat pocket. But a tinderbox was a slow ignition, and he had no time for slow. He looked at Balin, at the troll, at the ground between them, and then at the second bottle in his pack. He pulled the second bottle out and threw it at the troll's chest. The glass broke across the ice armor, and the spirits ran down into the plate gaps clear and fast, and the smell hit the air immediately, sharp and clean above the cold. The troll flinched at the impact, not from pain but from the cold shock of liquid against its face, and in that half-second of distraction, Julian struck the 2 bottles together at an angle, glass edge against glass edge, the way he'd done it 100 times over open barrels to test proof. The strike threw a weak scatter of sparks, barely enough, barely, but the spirits caught. The flame that ran up the troll's chest was small and then immediately not small. It found the gaps in the ice armor where the alcohol had pooled, and it went into them. And the troll made a sound that was entirely different from the first one, high and sharp and reflexive, and it staggered back a step. The ice plates on its chest ran with meltwater, the structural integrity compromising in real time, joints loosening as the ice thinned. Balin released the chain. The weighted end connected with the troll's exposed ribs in a sound like a tree coming down, a deep structural crack that Julian felt in his sternum. The troll folded to the right and went down onto one knee, and Balin was already hauling the chain back, resetting her grip, her breath coming in long, controlled pulls. She struck again at the shoulder joint where the ice had thinned most, and this time the troll went fully down, the ice armor shedding in large pieces as it hit the slope, and it slid 3 meters before it stopped moving. Julian stood with 2 broken bottlenecks in his hands, his coat smelling of spirits and singed wool where a spark had caught the hem. He looked at the troll. He looked at Balin, standing over the fallen shape with the chain gathered in her fists, chest heaving, one boot planted in the shattered ice. Then he looked back down the ridge, east and west, checking the snowbanks, checking the shapes of them, counting. The one the troll had come from was the only one built wrong. He didn't say anything yet, but he filed the shape of it, that too regular curve, that solid consistency, into the part of his mind that tracked threats, and he looked at every snowbank on the ridge with different eyes from that point forward. They found the ice cave 2 hours past the ridge, cut into the base of a glacial wall where a melt channel had carved inward and then frozen over in a previous season. The entrance was low. Julian had to duck, and Balin had to fold herself nearly in half to get through, the chain scraping the ceiling in a long metallic note. But inside it opened into a space the size of a modest room, with walls smooth from the old water flow and a floor of compressed ice that had been insulated from the wind long enough to be several degrees warmer than outside. Not warm, but survivable in a way the open ridge was not. Julian dropped his pack and immediately began building a fire against the back wall, where the ceiling was highest and a natural fissure in the ice ran upward. Not a full chimney, but enough draw to pull smoke if he kept the fire small and the wood dry. He used the last of the hardwood he'd been carrying from the settlement, splitting it with the back edge of the cold chisel into thin pieces that would catch fast and burn controlled. He worked quickly, but not frantically, organizing the tinder in the layered sequence that his first kitchen mentor had drilled into him so many years ago that it had stopped being technique and become reflex. Dry grass at the center, thin splits around it in a loose cone, larger pieces standing ready to feed once the base held. Balin settled against the side wall and watched. She did this often, watched him work with a quality of attention that wasn't casual. It reminded Julian of the way certain soldiers observed unfamiliar weapons being handled, that specific concentration of someone cataloging a skill they didn't have and weren't sure they could trust. Her clan, he assumed, cooked the way most northern warrior clans cooked, over open fire, unseasoned, consumed fast, and forgotten faster. Food as fuel and nothing more. The idea of a man crouching over a flame with a small paper pouch of dried pine nuts, arranging them at the edge of the heat with the deliberate patience of someone who cared how they turned out, this seemed to occupy her in a way she hadn't chosen and couldn't quite dismiss. The pine nuts were the last of what he'd foraged 3 days back, found in a cache under the root shelf of a fallen tree before the tree line had given out entirely. He spread them at the fire's warm edge and watched them begin to move. That small shift when the oil in the nut heats and the surface starts to color, going from pale to gold in a narrow window that closed fast if you stopped paying attention. He pulled them back at the right moment and tipped them into the tin cup he used for everything that wasn't broth. The smell that filled the cave was immediate and specific, rich, slightly sweet, the kind of smell that belonged to closed kitchens and warm stone floors, and none of the things that surrounded them now. Julian hadn't intended it to mean anything. It just did. He sat with the cup between his palms and felt the warmth through the metal, and didn't examine the feeling further. He poured half the nuts into the cup's lid and held it toward Balin without ceremony. She looked at it for a moment, with the same measured pause she brought to anything he offered. Then she took the lid and tilted a few nuts into her palm and ate them one at a time, slowly, with an expression that moved through several things and settled on something guarded but present. She chewed in silence. He ate from his half, and they sat with the fire between them and the wind working at the cave entrance without finding a way through. His hands had taken damage during the day. The knuckles on his right hand had split in 2 places from the cold and the work with the chisel, and the broken bottle strike had opened a small cut across the heel of his palm that he hadn't noticed until the adrenaline had cleared. He cleaned it now with a strip of cloth and the last of the spirits he'd decanted into a small flask for medical use, pressing the cloth against the cut until the bleeding slowed. The cold actually helped with that. There were advantages to everything, if you looked for them. Balin's gaze had moved from the fire to his hands. She watched him work the cloth against the cut with the same observational focus she gave everything, and when he glanced up, she didn't look away, which was either confidence or something else he hadn't named yet. A thin scar ran across the back of her left hand, wide and old, the kind left by a blade drawn slowly rather than struck fast. There were others on her forearms, parallel, deliberate, spaced in a way that wasn't accidental. Gladiatorial marking, maybe, or the record system some northern clans used instead of written language. He didn't ask. The scars were old enough to be history, and history was hers to give or keep. He put the cloth away and flexed his hand once, testing, then pulled a strip of dried meat from his pack and began slicing it into a small pot with the paring knife he kept in the outside pocket. The blade was short and kept sharp, and his hands moved in the automatic rhythm of prep work, breaking the strip into consistent pieces, setting them to soften in a small amount of meltwater he'd collected at the cave entrance. It was going to be a thin meal by any reasonable standard, but thin and hot was a different category than thin and cold, and he could make the difference with what he had. The fire popped once and settled into a steady, low burn, and the pine nut smell had worked into the cold air of the cave and stayed there, layered over the old mineral smell of the ice. Outside, the wind had changed pitch, dropping slightly, cycling toward the pause that often came before a temperature shift. Julian had learned to track that sound. A dropping wind in the tundra at nightfall usually meant the temperature was about to fall sharply. The clear cold that followed a weather system pressing down from above. He fed another split of wood to the fire and didn't say anything about it. But he built it slightly higher than he'd planned. The temperature dropped the way Julian had expected, not gradually but in a step, a sudden subtraction that changed the quality of the air inside the cave from tolerable to something with teeth in it. He felt it first in his nose, then in his ears, then in the joints of his fingers where the cold always settled last and deepest. The fire had burned to a low bed of coals by the 2nd hour of the night, and he'd made the choice to let it die rather than burn through the last of the hardwood before morning. A calculated risk. The cave walls held more warmth than open ground, and his sleeping bag was wool, doubled at the lining. He'd slept in worse. He zipped himself in fully and lay on his side facing the cave wall, listening to the wind work at the entrance. It had found a gap somewhere in the irregular mouth of the cave, a narrow channel between 2 ice shelves, and it pushed through that gap in a thin, continuous stream that ran along the floor and pooled against the back wall where he'd laid his bag. He felt it almost immediately. Not a gust, but a steady bleed of cold against the base of his spine, the kind that didn't announce itself as dangerous until it had already been working for an hour. He shifted position, pulling his knees tighter, tucking the bag's opening under his chin. The shivering started at his shoulders and worked down, that involuntary rhythm his body used when it stopped trusting the insulation around it. The coals gave off almost no light. The cave was dark in a way that outdoor darkness rarely was. Complete, without the ambient reflection of snow or sky. He could hear Balin breathing somewhere to his left, a slow and controlled sound that he'd noticed earlier had the quality of wakefulness kept quiet rather than actual sleep. He didn't speak. He closed his eyes and focused on slowing his own breathing, the technique he used on cold camp nights to conserve heat, and waited for his body temperature to stabilize. It didn't stabilize. The draft from the entrance kept finding him, working around the edges of the bag with the patient persistence of something that had all night. His jaw had begun to clench against it by the third hour, and he was aware, in the distant, managing way you tracked problems you couldn't immediately solve, that sustained shivering burned reserves he didn't have to spare. Tomorrow was a long day on exposed ground. He needed what sleep he could get. He shifted again, trying to angle his back away from the draft line, and the cold followed him. He didn't hear her move. That was the thing that struck him later, when he thought about it. That something her size had crossed the floor of that cave in complete silence, which meant she'd chosen to be quiet about it, the way you chose words before speaking them. The first thing he knew was warmth. Not gradual warmth, not the slow recovery of insulation working. Immediate warmth, a wall of it, pressing against his back through the sleeping bag like a hand placed flat. He went still. His shivering stopped in the way that startled animals went still, that total suspension of motion while the mind caught up to what the body had already registered. She had curled herself around him, not holding. There was no grip, no arm across his shoulders, nothing that would have required a decision to accept or refuse. She had simply arranged her body in a long curve behind his, her spine to the cave wall and her front to his back, her knees drawn up behind his, her broad frame blocking the entrance draft entirely. The chain lay somewhere behind her, settled quiet. The heat that radiated from her was extraordinary. Not the thin warmth of another human body, but something deeper, a furnace warmth that came from a metabolism built for northern campaigns, a core temperature that ran several degrees higher than anything Julian's biology produced. He lay very still and stared at the ice wall 6 inches from his face. The clansmen who'd condemned her had built the punishment around this, around the fact that an orc berserker in open tundra would burn through her reserves fighting the cold and be dead inside 3 days. They'd calculated it correctly, as a physics problem. They hadn't calculated what she'd do with warmth once she had access to it, which was preserve it, the way someone who had gone without a thing long enough learns to be careful with it when it comes back. She wasn't giving him warmth out of softness. She was making a practical decision about resource allocation, the same way he'd made one when he'd given her the larger share of the broth. He understood this. It made it easier to accept. His shivering had stopped entirely. The cold still existed. He could hear the wind in the gap, could feel the ambient temperature of the ice through the bag, but it had moved from threat to background, managed by the wall of heat at his back. His jaw unclenched. His breathing slowed on its own, following the rhythm it found when genuine sleep was actually possible rather than just attempted. He thought, briefly, about what a strange piece of information this would be to explain to anyone who hadn't been in this cave, on this night, in this cold. He thought about what a different thing warmth became when you'd been without it long enough. How it stopped being comfort and became something more essential, something you held around yourself with both hands and didn't question the source of. Then he stopped thinking about it, because the warmth was working, and his body had decided that thinking was less important than sleeping, and for once he agreed with his body. The fire was fully out. The cave was dark, and the wind found no new gaps to work through, and outside the temperature continued its long drop toward whatever floor the night had decided on. Inside, the draft that had run along the floor hit the curve of Balin's back and scattered into nothing, and Julian slept. He woke to the smell of cold stone and the sound of ice ticking in the cave walls. That slow, structural sound that meant the temperature outside had peaked and begun its grudging retreat back toward something livable. The light at the cave entrance was gray and diffuse. The particular flatness of early morning filtered through overcast. Julian lay still for a moment with his eyes open, taking inventory the way he always did before moving. Hands, feet, jaw, the cut on his palm. Everything reported back. The palm was stiff but sealed. His shoulders ached from sleeping on ice even through the bag, but that was ordinary damage, the kind that walked off. Balin was already sitting upright against the wall, the chain coiled in her lap, watching the entrance. She'd moved sometime before dawn without waking him, which meant the draft had died down enough that the shield was no longer necessary. And she'd made the calculation to withdraw before he woke. He noticed this and didn't comment on it. Some things were easier to accept if they weren't named. He sat up and reached for the small tin pot he used for brewing and packed it with snow from the cave entrance, setting it over the tinderbox flame to melt. His fingers moved through the familiar routine while his mind came the rest of the way awake. The ginger root from the inner pack pocket, the dried chili flakes in the twist of paper he kept nested with the salt, the small wooden stirring stick worn smooth from years of use. He worked in the particular silence of someone who cooked not because the situation demanded ceremony, but because the routine itself was a form of steadiness, a way of telling the body that the night was over and the day was beginning, and there was still enough order in things to make tea. When the water came up, he dropped the ginger slice in and let it steep until the color shifted, then added the chili flakes and a pinch of salt, and poured half into the tin cup's lid and half into the cup itself, and held the cup out toward Balin. She took it without hesitation this time, which was a change from 2 days ago that he noted without ceremony. She wrapped both hands around it and lifted it and drank, and the spice hit her somewhere behind the eyes. He could see it in the slight tension across her brow, the involuntary blink. But she kept drinking, pulling the heat down in long, deliberate swallows, chasing the burn with the next mouthful, the way you chased one discomfort with a chosen one. "Why blades for carrots?" she said eventually, her voice still carrying the rough texture of sleep and cold. She was looking at his paring knife where it sat beside the pack, its short blade cleaned and folded. The question was blunt in the way her questions generally were. Not rude, but stripped of the social scaffolding that most people built around their curiosity. She wanted to know the thing, so she asked for the thing. Julian drank from the lid and thought about it honestly. He'd cooked for the royal household for 4 years, for a general's campaign kitchen for 2, for a merchant caravan for 1 long, miserable winter that he didn't look back on with any fondness. He'd handled blades his entire adult life. Boning knives, cleavers, the long, flexible filleting blade that took a decade to learn properly. He knew how to use them. He'd chosen not to repurpose that knowledge, and it wasn't a philosophy so much as a preference that had hardened into habit. "A knife that's cut a man," he said, "cuts everything else differently afterward. I liked what I was doing with them." He paused, turning the lid in his hands. Didn't want to change what they meant. She considered this with the same attention she gave the horizon when she was reading terrain, not agreeing, not dismissing, just processing it against something internal. The firelight from the tinderbox was small and low, barely enough to push the shadows back from their faces. But it was enough to see the scar that ran across her jaw, the old one, wider than the others, that curved up from the corner of her mouth and disappeared into the line of her cheekbone. A blade scar, long healed, from something that had come very close to ending the conversation of her life entirely. She drank the last of the tea and turned the cup in her hands, running one thumb along the rim, the way people handled objects when they were thinking about something they hadn't decided to say yet. The chain shifted in her lap. Outside, a gust hit the cave entrance and passed, and the light of the opening shifted slightly as the cloud cover moved, and for a moment the interior of the cave was almost bright before it settled back to gray. Julian pulled the remaining dried meat from his pack and divided it on the flat of his palm. 2 portions, hers larger, the same division he'd made every time without discussion. She took hers and ate it slowly, without the speed of the first day, chewing with a patience that hadn't been there when she'd been running on empty. The body, when it stopped panicking, remembered how to do things at a reasonable pace. He'd seen it in recovering soldiers, in exhausted farmhands, in anyone who'd gone without long enough that having enough became a thing to pay attention to rather than race through. He shouldered the pack and picked up the staff, and she rose from the wall, and the chain rang once against the ice floor, and they moved to the entrance. At the threshold she stopped and looked back at the place where the fire had been, the darkened circle of ice, the small debris of split wood. She stood there for a moment with an expression that gave nothing away, and then she turned and ducked through the opening, and Julian followed her out into the flat gray morning. The cold hit immediately, direct and thorough, but manageable in the way that cold was always manageable when you'd slept. The ridge stretched north ahead of them, the snow surface marked by the previous day's wind into long, parallel ridges like something combed. Julian checked the compass bearing and adjusted their line slightly west and started walking, his boots finding the rhythm of the previous day, staff swinging forward and probing and returning. Behind him, the chain scraped its familiar line through the snow, steady and consistent, erasing his tracks as it always did, and the morning held. The lake announced itself before it appeared. The wind changed first, losing its friction, going smooth and fast across a surface that offered nothing to slow it. And then the sound changed, that specific absence of crunch underfoot replaced by a denser silence, the compressed quiet of deep ice over deeper water. Julian slowed his pace. He pressed his staff into the snow ahead and felt the resistance shift from the soft give of packed drift to the hard, faintly resonant knock of ice underneath. And the knock traveled back up the wood and into his palm like a question. He stopped at the edge where the snow thinned and looked out across it. The lake was wide, wider than the cartographer's map had suggested, which meant either the map was wrong again, or they'd drifted slightly east of the intended line. He couldn't see the far shore clearly through the overcast, just the suggestion of a tree line, dark and low against the white horizon. The ice surface was clear, in the way very deep cold made ice clear. The snow blown off by the ridge wind until the surface showed through like old glass, gray-green and marbled with trapped air pockets that ran in long, suspended streaks beneath the surface. It looked solid. That meant nothing. Ice that looked solid had drowned people with more tundra experience than Julian. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the surface and held it there for 10 seconds, reading the temperature differential between the ice and the air above it. The ice was colder, which was what you wanted. It meant the surface was still freezing down rather than thawing up from the water beneath. He stood and walked along the edge until he found a place where the ice met the shore bank in a clean seam, and he set the end of his staff against the surface and pressed his full weight down onto it in a slow, steady push. The ice held without complaint. Balin had stopped 3 paces behind him and was watching the surface with an expression that was difficult to read. He'd learned in the last 2 days that her face operated on a different economy than most. Less movement carrying more information, the way spare writing could hold more weight than florid writing. What he read in her now wasn't fear exactly, but a specific quality of alertness. the kind directed at something known rather than something imagined. He explained the crossing without framing it as a request. Spread weight, slow pace, no sharp movements that would send vibration through the ice. The chain, a problem because metal on ice conducted sound in ways that created stress fractures along existing fault lines. She listened with her arms at her sides and her eyes on the lake. When he told her to hold the chain gathered in her hands rather than letting it drag, she bent and picked up the length of it in one arm, coiling it against her chest in a loose bundle, the weight of it shifting her center of balance slightly. She adjusted for this without comment, planting her feet wider. They stepped out onto the ice together, Julian a pace ahead, the staff moving from a probing tool to a balance aid, its tip set light against the surface rather than pressed hard. The ice under his boots made no sound for the first 20 meters, which was the best possible sign. Silent ice was bonded ice, the layers fused without air gaps. He breathed slowly and moved in the deliberate, sliding step he'd learned for this kind of crossing, keeping his weight distributed across the whole foot rather than concentrated at the heel. The lake surface under his boots was extraordinary up close, the kind of thing he'd have stopped to look at in any other circumstance. The trapped air pockets ran in formations that looked almost botanical, long branching shapes frozen in mid-expansion, reaching upward from the black water below toward the surface they'd never reached. Beneath those formations the water was not visible so much as implied, a depth that the eye suggested rather than confirmed, the darkness below the green-gray of the ice that deepened incrementally until there was nothing to see at all. He was looking at the air pocket formations rather than his feet when his knee hit the surface. The slip was small, a boot finding a slick patch where the ice had a slight incline and nothing to grip, and he went down fast, his knee connecting with the ice in a sharp impact that sent a shockwave up his thigh and knocked the staff sideways. The cracks spread from the point of impact in 3 directions simultaneously, a clear spiderweb pattern running outward in thin, pale lines, the sound of it traveling through the ice under his palms like something tearing slowly. He held completely still, both palms flat, staff horizontal beside him, calculating the silence. The ice groaned once, deep and structural, and then went quiet. He was aware of Balin behind him, of the complete stillness she dropped into the moment he fell, the chain locked in her arm, her breathing suspended. The shore was 20 meters ahead. He didn't look back. He pressed himself carefully upright, distributing the weight back onto his feet in the slowest movement he could manage, feeling the ice accept it in increments. The cracks held. They didn't spread further. Then Balin stepped forward and placed herself directly over the largest crack, her boots spanning it, her weight distributed deliberately across the fracture rather than around it. "Move," she said quietly. "To the shore. Don't look at it." There was no urgency in her voice, just the flat, practiced authority of someone who had made this type of decision before and understood that speed was now more important than caution. Julian moved. He walked toward the shore with his eyes ahead and the staff swinging light and regular in front of him, listening to the ice beneath his feet and to the chain gathered in Balin's arm behind him and to the deep, ancient water shifting below both of them. The shore bank rose ahead, steep and dark against the ice, its frozen mud surface marked with the gouges of old flood lines. 20 meters. 15. 10. He reached the shore and stepped up onto the frozen mud bank and turned. Below the clear ice, deep in the green, dark water, shapes moved. Not fish. Too large, too deliberate, moving in the same direction he and Balin had walked, tracking the line of their crossing from below. Balin reached the bank in 8 long strides, stepping off the ice without ceremony and landing on the frozen mud beside him. She looked down at the lake surface immediately, following his gaze, and her body went very still in the way it did when she was reading something. The shapes below the ice had slowed when they reached the shallows near the shore, where the water was too thin to contain them, and they hovered now in the murk just beyond the depth line. 3 distinct forms, broad and slow, moving in the patient rotation of things that were not in a hurry because they didn't need to be. Julian had seen ice trolls break through snowbanks. He hadn't known they could move through water beneath lake ice, using it as cover the way a hunting animal used tall grass. And the knowledge rearranged several assumptions he'd been carrying about how to read this landscape. The cartographer had mentioned the trolls as a surface threat, something you watched the snowbanks for. The cartographer, Julian was increasingly convinced, had compiled his information from people who had survived encounters rather than people who had understood them. He turned from the lake and assessed the bank. It rose steeply from the ice edge, 3 meters of frozen mud and compacted soil, the face of it smooth and nearly vertical where the spring floods had cut it clean over years of high water. Handholds were sparse, 2 root sections protruding from the midsection, a horizontal crack running across the face at roughly knee height where the mud had contracted in the cold, and a narrow ledge of harder material at the top edge where the substrate changed from flood mud to glacial till. Climbable, but not quickly and not cleanly, especially not with a pack and a staff and hands that had already taken damage from the previous day. He looked at Balin, who was looking at the bank with the same evaluation running behind her eyes. The chain was still coiled in her arm. "The roots," he said quietly, and she nodded once, already moving toward the base of the bank. She drove the fingers of her free hand into the mud face where the frost hadn't fully penetrated, finding purchase in the softer material beneath the surface crust, and began to climb with the deliberate economy of someone who understood how to move weight up a vertical surface without relying on the surface to cooperate. Julian got both hands on the lower root section and pulled himself up to the knee-height crack and wedged his boot into it and pushed. The frozen mud under his fingers was slick where the ice had formed a skin over the surface, and the skin broke away in sheets when he gripped it, leaving him grabbing at the raw material underneath. He moved in short intervals. Find a hold, test it, commit, find the next one, and tried not to think about the sounds coming from the lake behind him, because there were sounds now. The ice was not breaking, not yet. But it was speaking. That deep tonal shift from the tick of thermal contraction to something more directional, more deliberate. The sound of sustained pressure applied from below. He didn't look back. Looking back would have required releasing a handhold, and releasing a handhold would have put him on the ground, and the ground was the wrong place to be. He was 2/3 up the bank when his right boot lost its purchase entirely. The kick-step he'd cut into the mud sheared away cleanly, the frozen crust separating from the material beneath it, and he swung inward against the bank face with his full weight on his 2 handholds, his legs scrambling for contact and finding nothing solid. The pack shifted on his back, pulling him slightly outward, and for a sustained and unpleasant moment, the arithmetic of the situation was not in his favor. Balin was already at the top of the bank. He heard the chain ring against the hard till surface above him, heard her boots find solid ground, and then her hand came back over the edge, not reaching blindly, but placed deliberately, palm up, wrist level with his face. He grabbed it, and she pulled, not in a lunge, but in one smooth, continuous movement that walked him up the remaining face of the bank as if his weight was a consideration she'd already accounted for. She deposited him onto the till surface at the top with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a familiar task, and he got his feet under him and stood. He looked back down at the lake. The ice surface had changed. Where it had been clear and unmarked, 3 distinct formations of pressure fractures now ran from the deep water toward the shore, each one a radiating web of cracks moving in a straight line, converging on the point where he and Balin had stood minutes earlier. The shapes below the ice had reached the shallower water and stopped, the depth no longer sufficient to contain them, and they moved in slow, agitated circles beneath the cracked surface, testing the underside of the ice with short, deliberate impacts that sent new fracture lines spreading outward in pulses. They weren't breaking through. The ice was thick enough, barely, to hold at the shore shallows. But they were tracking the scent of the campfire smoke that still clung to Julian's coat. That specific combination of rendered fat and hardwood ash and chili oil that had apparently carried further and meant more to whatever olfactory system ice trolls operated on than Julian had accounted for. Every camp they'd made had been a signal. Every meal he'd cooked had been an advertisement. The thing he was best at had been pointing something dangerous toward them across the glacier for the last 2 days. He stood at the top of the bank with this information and looked at the gray sky and breathed out slowly. Balin stood beside him, the chain hanging at her side now, watching the shapes circle below the ice with an expression that had settled into something hard and forward-looking. The tree line was perhaps a kilometer north, dark against the white ground, the kind of dense frozen scrub that would break their scent trail and complicate pursuit. Julian shouldered his pack, adjusted the strap over his right shoulder where the muscle had pulled during the climb, and picked up the staff. They moved north at a pace that was not quite running. The tree line that had looked like salvation from the lake bank turned out to be 50 meters of frozen scrub, dwarf pine and ice cedar packed dense enough to break the wind but shallow enough to walk through in under 5 minutes. They came out the other side onto a shore embankment that dropped away sharply, the frozen mud face looking almost identical to the one they just climbed, except this one faced north, and the ground below it was not flat. It was the lake's outlet channel, drained and refrozen, the bed of it a jumble of ice-locked boulders and gravel bars and old flood debris that ran east and west as far as the flat light allowed him to see. Julian stood at the edge and looked down and did the arithmetic. The embankment was steeper than the one they'd climbed, 4 meters at least. The face cut back at a slight overhang where the summer current had undermined the base. The mud was slicker here, north-facing, never getting the direct sun that would have softened and then re-hardened it into something with grip. He pressed the staff tip against it and felt it skate immediately. No purchase. He looked east and west along the top edge for an alternative line and found nothing useful. The overhang ran in both directions without breaking, a consistent cut that the river had made over years without concern for anyone who might someday need to get down it quickly. He unscrewed the cap on the cooking spirits and looked at the bottle. A quarter remaining, maybe slightly less. He'd used most of it in the encounter on the ridge, the rest for the medical flask. Not enough for another fire burst, not reliably. He screwed the cap back on and put the bottle in the outer pocket, and tried to think clearly about the sequence of problems in front of him. The trolls had been tracking them across the glacier for at least 2 days. They had moved under the lake ice, which meant water wasn't a barrier. The scrub behind them was thin enough that scent would carry through it without difficulty. The embankment ahead was unclimbable by any fast means. Behind them, something cracked in the scrub. Not wind, directional, weighted. The sound of a large body moving through branches that resisted and broke. Then a second sound, further east, the same quality. Julian turned and looked back through the trees and saw nothing yet, but the sounds were getting clearer, and the scrub was only 50 meters deep. He looked at Balin and found her already looking at him with an expression that asked nothing and offered nothing, but was clearly waiting for whatever he was going to say next. He looked at the chain. The length of it from collar to end was approximately 2 meters, heavy gauge, the individual links worn smooth from dragging across stone and ice for the better part of 10 days. He looked at the overhang lip above the embankment face where the glacial till was exposed, harder material, denser, less prone to shearing than the flood mud below it. "The chain," he said. "Can you get a hook over the lip?" He gestured at the overhang edge. "Use it as an anchor." Get yourself down first, then hold the end for me." She looked at the lip, looked at the chain, looked at him with a brief expression that might have been the beginning of something exasperated, before it closed back into neutral. She stepped to the edge and swung the chain end in a short, controlled arc, letting it land across the lip rather than trying to hook it. The weight of the length hanging over the edge would do the work of holding it, the friction of iron on frozen till sufficient if she moved quickly and didn't let it shift. She went over the edge, with the chain paying out through her hands in a controlled descent, her boots finding holds that Julian couldn't see from above, moving with the speed of someone who understood that the time for careful climbing had passed. She reached the bottom in under 15 seconds and looked up, the chain end still in her hands, braced with both feet against the base of the embankment. The trolls broke through the scrub line behind him. There were 2 of them, and they'd come in from slightly different angles, which meant they'd been coordinating their approach through the trees rather than simply following a scent line, which was another piece of information Julian filed under things he wished he'd known earlier. The leading one was larger than the one on the ridge, the ice armor thicker at the shoulders, layered in the way armor got when a creature survived multiple seasons in extreme cold and the body kept depositing more. It came through the last of the trees and saw him and stopped, fixing him with the particular attention of something that had been tracking a specific scent for 2 days and had now found its origin. Julian looked at the quarter bottle of cooking spirits in his pocket. He looked at the trolls. He looked over the edge at Balin, who was looking up at him with the chain pulled taut in her hands, waiting. And then he made the decision that the quarter bottle was not sufficient for what he'd been planning, and reached into his pack for the jar of rendered animal fat instead. The fat had been solid since the first night, a dense, pale cylinder in a wide-mouthed glass jar, the rendering of a full autumn's worth of accumulated cooking fat that he'd processed before leaving the last settlement, compressed and sealed with a waxed cloth lid. He used it for cooking when the dried meat ran thin, for weatherproofing leather, for the tinderbox when the standard tinder ran damp. In solid form it sat inert and harmless. Dispersed and heated, it was something else entirely. He got the jar open with cold fingers and looked at the leading troll, which had taken 2 steps closer and lowered its head in the posture he'd seen on the ridge before the lunge. He had one chance to do this correctly and no margin for hesitation. And the cold and the altitude and the previous 2 days had reduced his hands to instruments he operated by instruction rather than feel. He gripped the jar and waited, letting the troll close the distance. And behind him, Balin's voice came up from below the embankment. Not a word, just a sound, low and urgent, the kind that meant now. And he threw the fat at the troll's face with everything his right arm had left. The fat hit the troll across the face and upper chest in a thick, pale smear, the cold, solid mass breaking apart on impact and coating the ice armor in a layer that the temperature immediately began to work on. Not melting it, the air was too cold for that, but thinning it, the rendered fat spreading into the surface irregularities of the ice plates and finding the gaps at the joints and running into them in slow, determined rivulets. The troll reared back, clawing at its face with both hands, not from pain but from obstruction. The fat had sealed across its eyes and nostrils in a layer thick enough to block, and it was operating blind for the moment, which was the only moment Julian had. He grabbed the chain at the lip of the overhang and went over the edge. He had no technique for this. He went down the face the way a man went down something he had no business going down, by controlled falling, boots skidding across the slick mud, hands burning on the chain links, the pack torquing his balance backward, and the staff jammed sideways through the shoulder strap because he'd had no time to set it properly. He hit a root section halfway down that stopped him for one lurching second, and then tore loose. and he covered the last 1.5 meters in a slide that ended when his boots found the frozen gravel of the channel bed, and his knees absorbed the impact badly, sending a bright shock up both legs that he noted and set aside. Balin had him by the back of his belt before he'd finished processing the landing. She hauled him upright in one movement and turned him north, and he went, finding his legs under him in the first few strides with the graceless urgency of someone whose body was ahead of his instructions. Above them, on the embankment lip, the troll had cleared enough fat from one eye to find them again. He could hear it, the change in its movement from confused to directed, the heavy impact of its body against the overhang edge as it found the drop and began to work out how to descend. The second troll was further back, still in the tree line, but moving. Julian could track it by sound now, the crack and release of branches, the direction of it moving to flank rather than follow directly, which told him it was running a parallel line to cut them off somewhere ahead. The channel bed ran north between walls of frozen gravel and old flood debris, and the walls compressed the options in a way that removed the possibility of veering east or west to break the flanking line. They were running in a channel, and the channel had walls, and the walls were going to end somewhere, and he needed to know where before the second troll did. His hands smelled powerfully of rendered fat. The jar had coated his palms when he'd opened it, and the cold had preserved the smell rather than dissipating it. He ran with his hands away from his coat instinctively, not wanting to transfer the scent to fabric he'd be wearing for the rest of the day. And the absurdity of this registered briefly and passed. The channel floor was uneven under his boots, gravel bars alternating with stretches of clear ice, the ice patches invisible until he was on them and the boots were sliding. He used the staff now as a third contact point, planting it ahead and to the right in a rhythmic pattern that gave him a fraction of extra stability on the ice sections, without costing him the pace he needed. Balin ran behind him and slightly to his left, the chain gathered in her arm again, her stride eating the ground in intervals that covered twice what his did. She was holding back to match his pace, which he understood without comfort. The knowledge that she could be at the far end of the channel already if she'd wanted to was simply a fact of the situation, like the cold or the embankment, something to note and incorporate rather than feel anything particular about. He saw the channel end coming before he reached it. The walls narrowed and the flood debris compacted into a natural dam of ice-locked boulders that blocked the channel bed from one wall to the other, 4 meters high and irregular, the kind of formation that had built over years of spring floods depositing and the cold cementing. There was no way through it quickly. The walls on either side were vertical, the same frozen mud as the embankment they descended, and the surface above the dam was exposed flat ground that offered nothing. He stopped at the base of the boulder dam and put both hands on the nearest ice-locked rock and felt it. Solid, fused, not going anywhere. He looked up at the top of the dam and looked back down the channel and looked at his pack, running the inventory in his head with the specific focus that came when the options narrowed to one. The cooking spirits were in the outer pocket. A 1/4 bottle. He'd dismissed it on the embankment as insufficient for a fire burst, and that assessment still held if he was trying to replicate what he'd done on the ridge. Throw it onto an open flame and create a burst large enough to damage ice armor. But what he was thinking now was different. Dispersed fat was flammable. He had a 1/4 bottle of high-proof spirits and 2 hands that smelled powerfully of rendered fat and a troll whose face and chest were coated in the same material. He pulled the spirits from his pocket and uncapped it and looked at the channel behind him. The leading troll had made it down the embankment. He could hear the impact of it landing on the channel bed, the crunch of gravel under its weight, the resumption of its movement toward them. 30 meters back, maybe slightly less. The second troll's sounds had stopped, which meant it had found a line and was moving quietly, which was worse than when he could track it. Julian poured the remaining spirit slowly across his fat-coated palms, coating them in the mixture. Fat and alcohol combined. The alcohol thinning the fat and increasing its surface area, the combination running into the creases of his knuckles and between his fingers in a way that would carry the flame. He looked at Balin and told her what he needed. She looked at his hands, then at the boulders on the dam face above them, and the line of her jaw tightened once before she turned and began to climb. The troll came around the last bend in the channel at a pace that said it had stopped being cautious. It had cleared most of the fat from its eyes by now, smearing it across the ice armor of its forearms in long, pale streaks, and it moved with the directional certainty of something that had reacquired its target and intended to close the remaining distance without interruption. The ice armor on its chest had partially refused in the cold during the pursuit, the rendered fat sealed beneath a new skin of ice that had formed over it as the troll ran, which meant the material was still there, still coating the joints and filling the gaps, locked now under a surface layer that would need to be broken before anything beneath it could catch. Julian stood at the base of the boulder dam with his coated hands held slightly away from his sides, and watched the troll cover the distance between them with the focused calm of someone who had committed to a sequence of actions and was waiting for the correct moment to begin the first one. The channel walls compressed the space to roughly 4 meters of usable ground, which removed the troll's ability to circle or flank and reduced the encounter to a straight line. This was the only structural advantage he had, and he'd positioned himself to use it. Above him on the dam, Balin moved across the boulder face with the chain gathered in her right hand, and her left finding holds in the ice-locked gaps between rocks. She was 2/3 up, working toward a section of the dam face where the glacial till of the channel wall met the outer edge of the boulder formation, a seam of compressed material that would be harder than the flood-deposited rock and closer in composition to the flint-bearing substrate he needed. He could hear the chain ringing against stone as she moved, the sound of it carrying down the channel in the cold air, and he kept that sound in his peripheral attention the same way he kept a timer running when something was reducing on the stove. Not the focus, but the awareness. The troll was 15 meters away when it lunged. It didn't build to the lunge with telegraphing posture the way the ridge troll had. This one converted its running pace directly into a forward drop, both arms extending, the ice-armored shoulders driving the weight of its body ahead of its feet in a movement designed to cover ground faster than a target could respond to. Julian stepped hard left, putting his shoulder against the channel wall, and the troll's right hand caught the edge of his pack instead of his body, spinning him into the wall with an impact that drove the breath out of him and left a smear of pale fat across the pack's outer surface where the troll's arm had made contact. He pushed off the wall and got his footing on the gravel and looked up at Balin on the dam face. She had reached the seam. She had the chain gathered in both hands now, the length of it compressed into a short, heavy loop, swinging it in the tight controlled arc he'd seen on the ridge. Not the full 2-meter swing she used in open ground, but a precise, short-radius strike aimed at the specific point where the channel wall met the dam face, the flint-bearing seam that ran in a pale line across the dark material of the till. The troll turned from the wall and located him again, and he threw his hands outward in a sharp, explosive gesture, fingers spread, palms facing the troll, dispersing the fat and alcohol mixture from his hands in a fine spray that the cold air caught and held for one suspended moment as a mist between them. Balin brought the chain down across the flint seam with her full weight behind it. The sparks came off the impact in a shower rather than a scatter, a bright, sustained spray of white-hot fragments that arced outward and downward from the strike point in a fan that caught the suspended mist of fat and spirits at the center of the channel. The ignition was not a whomp or a roar, but a fast, low sound, almost structural, like something clicking into place. And then the flame was simply there, not a fire burst like the ridge encounter, but a sustained sheet of it, running along the airborne fat droplets and finding the troll's chest where the refused ice had sealed the rendered fat against the armor joints, and going into those joints with the particular efficiency of a flame that had found fuel waiting for it. The troll made the high, sharp sound he'd heard on the ridge and tried to back away from itself, which was not a thing it could do. The flame ran the lines of its armor joints in orange threads, finding every place the fat had penetrated and sealing the armor had trapped it. And the ice over those joints thinned and ran, and the underlying material reached its ignition point in seconds. It clawed at its chest with both hands, and the motion fed air to the flame, and the flame took the air and grew, and the troll's rearward motion became a fall, the legs going out from under it as the heat reached the knee joints of its armor and the structural integrity there compromised. It went down across the channel gravel in a cascade of cracking ice armor and flame, and the impact sent a pulse of heat up the channel walls that Julian felt across his face and bare hands and stood in for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, the warmth of it hitting every cold, damaged surface of his skin with an intensity that was almost painful and then immediately wasn't. He felt his belt lurch upward. Balin had descended the damn face in the time it had taken him to register what he was feeling, and she had 2 fingers hooked through his belt at the back and was already climbing, hauling him up the boulder face beside her, with the brisk matter-of-factness of someone retrieving something they'd left behind. He found the handholds with hands that no longer had much sensation in them, and climbed anyway, his boots finding the gaps in the boulders by some combination of muscle memory and Balin's upward pull, and they crested the top of the dam together as the second troll broke from the channel wall below them and found its packmate burning on the gravel. The second troll didn't climb. It stood at the base of the boulder dam and looked up at them with its pale, deeply set eyes. And then it looked at its packmate burning on the channel gravel, and something in its posture shifted. Not fear, exactly, but a recalibration. The change in a predator's body when the mathematics of an encounter stop adding up in its favor. It circled the burning form once in a slow, deliberate arc, and then it turned and moved back down the channel the way it had come, unhurried, as if it had simply decided the scent trail wasn't worth the arithmetic anymore. Julian sat down on the flat ground above the dam and didn't immediately stand back up. His hands had stopped reporting sensation below the second knuckle, which was partly the cold and partly the fat and spirits coating that had burned off during the ignition, leaving the skin underneath reddened and tight. He turned them over and looked at the palms, reading the damage with the same clinical detachment he'd developed over years of kitchen work, where burns and cuts were occupational data rather than personal injury. Superficial, mostly. The heel of his left hand, where the bottle cut had been, was worse. The climb had reopened it, and the cold had prevented it from communicating this clearly until now. He pressed the heel of his right hand against it and held it. Balin dropped onto the ground beside him with the chain settling around her in a loose coil, her chest moving in the long, controlled pulls of someone bringing their breathing back to a working pace after sustained exertion. She sat with her forearms resting on her knees and her head slightly forward, and they stayed like that for a time without speaking, listening to the channel below them where the burning troll made diminishing sounds and the second troll's retreat faded into the ambient noise of the wind. The sky had changed while they'd been in the channel. The cloud cover had thinned in the west, and a band of pale light was pushing through along the horizon. Not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of it. The kind of light that arrived in the tundra late in the cold season and reminded you that the season was, eventually, going to end. It fell across the flat ground ahead of them in a long stripe that reached north toward the horizon, and where it hit the snow, the surface sparkled with the specific quality of ice crystals that had formed in very still, very cold air. Intricate and temporary, the kind of thing that lasted until the first wind came and redistributed everything. He looked north and found what he'd been navigating toward for 4 days. The geothermal springs announced themselves in the distance as a faint column of vapor rising from the flat ground, pale against the sky, moving in a slow, rightward drift with the wind. At this distance it looked almost incidental, the kind of thin smoke a dying fire produced. He knew from the cartographer's description that up close it was something else entirely. A field of mineral pools kept liquid year-round by the heat rising from the fractured rock below, the water in them running at temperatures that would sustain life without fire, without shelter, without the constant management of warmth that had occupied every waking calculation for the last 4 days. The orc settlements in the far north used them as winter refuges. There were stories. He'd heard them in the last settlement, told with the casual off-handedness of local knowledge, of injured soldiers reaching them half dead and walking out weeks later with their frostbite healed and their reserves rebuilt. He pointed north with one reddened hand. Balin lifted her head and looked, and he watched her find the vapor column and hold it in her gaze for a moment with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was simply present, simply here, stripped of the guardedness she'd carried since the first night. It lasted only a few seconds before her face closed back into its usual economy. But he'd seen it, and he didn't look away while it was there. She reached over without looking at him and pressed the broad pad of her thumb against his cheek. He went still. She worked the thumb across the skin just below his left eye in a short, deliberate stroke and withdrew her hand. And when he touched the same spot, he found the smear of soot she'd removed, a deposit from the ignition blast that he hadn't known was there. She examined the mark on her thumb and rubbed it against her palm and said nothing. And Julian looked at the vapor column in the north and said nothing either. His hands smelled of smoke and cold fat and dried blood from the cut on his palm, and the smell of it sat in his nose with a particular completeness of things that had been earned rather than acquired. He pulled the medical cloth from his pack and wound it around the heel of his hand properly this time, working the wrapping with his teeth and his other hand, and Balin watched him struggle with it for approximately 4 seconds before she reached over and held the end of the cloth against his palm with one finger while he completed the wrap. The assistance was wordless and brief and entirely practical, and he tied off the bandage and flexed the hand once and nodded. Below them in the channel, the burning had gone to embers. The second troll was long gone, its sounds absorbed entirely by the distance and the wind. The channel stretched back south toward the lake, and above the lake somewhere the glacier ran on toward the pressure ridge, and beyond the ridge the ice cave sat empty, with its cold fire ring and its smell of pine nuts already fading from the air. 4 days of ground covered, in the way ground was always covered. One step deciding the next, no step retrievable. Julian picked up the staff and got to his feet. His knees reported their objections with the specificity of joints that had absorbed too many hard landings on frozen ground, and intended to make sure he knew about each one individually. He acknowledged this and stood up anyway, shouldering the pack, adjusting the strap over the shoulder that had taken the impact against the channel wall. The vapor column rose in the north, and the light held in the west, and the wind came from somewhere indifferent and moved across both of them without distinction. Balin rose beside him, the chain hanging at her side, and looked north with him at the rising steam. Then she started walking, and he fell into step beside her rather than behind, the ground ahead flat enough that the staff served as a walking rhythm rather than a probe, and their shadows ran long to the east in the thin, late light. They reached the springs as the light failed. The vapor column had looked thin from the dam, but walking into it was something else. A wall of warm, mineral-heavy air that hit Julian's face like a hand pressed flat against cold skin, the contrast so immediate that his eyes watered and his lungs pulled at it involuntarily, deeper than his usual measured breathing, the body deciding without consultation that it was going to take as much of this as it could get. The ground changed underfoot from compacted snow to a softer, granular surface, where the heat rising through the rock kept the frost from penetrating fully, and then the snow gave out entirely, replaced by dark, bare earth that steamed faintly at the edges where it met the cold air. The pools themselves were scattered across an area roughly the size of a market square, irregular in shape, their surfaces moving in the slow, continuous shimmer of water that was genuinely warm rather than merely unfrozen. The mineral content colored them, some pale blue, some the yellow-gray of sulfur deposits, some nearly clear with a dark, rocky bottom visible 2 meters down. The smell was sharp and specific, the sulfur underlaid by something older and more fundamental. The smell of the Earth's own heat finding its way to the surface through cracks in the rock that had been there long before anything walked above them. Julian stopped at the edge of the nearest pool and crouched and held his bandaged hand above the surface, reading the warmth coming off it before he committed to contact. Then he unwound the bandage and lowered his hand into the water to the wrist and held it there. The heat worked into the damaged tissue in a way that the body recognized as repair rather than threat, and the cut on his palm, which had been making its presence known with increasing clarity during the final hour of walking, went quiet in the way things went quiet when the conditions around them finally changed in their favor. He stayed like that for a long time, crouched at the pool's edge with one hand in the water and his eyes on the far side of the spring field, where the vapor thickened into a genuine mist. Behind him he heard Balin moving, the chain, then the specific sound of armor being removed, the creak and knock of stiffened leather straps worked loose from their fittings by hands that had been doing it for years and knew the sequence without needing light. He didn't turn around. He listened to the sounds of it and looked at the water and gave her the privacy of being unwatched while she did something necessary. The splash when she entered one of the larger pools was substantial, the water level rising and sloshing at the edges, and the sound she made was not a word. It was the involuntary sound of a body receiving something it had been refusing to ask for, compressed and short and quickly controlled. He heard her settle, heard the chain ring once against the pool's stone rim, and then go quiet as she found a position and stayed in it. The mist drifted between them, and the springs made their small, constant sounds, and the tundra wind that had been pushing at them for 4 days ran across the top of the warm air above the spring field and found nothing to work on. Julian eventually stood and moved to a smaller pool a few meters east and removed his coat and his boots and his pack and got in. The heat was extraordinary. It found every place the cold had been living, the joints of his fingers, the base of his spine, the pulled muscle in his right shoulder, the knees that had been cataloging their complaints since the channel, and it addressed them in sequence, methodical and thorough, the way a good fire addressed a cold room, starting at the edges and working inward. He sat on the rock bottom with the water to his chest and breathed the sulfur-warm air and looked at the sky above the mist, where the cloud cover had continued to thin and the first hard points of stars were appearing in the gaps. He built a small fire at the pool's edge when his hands were capable of it. The last of the hardwood, split fine, more for light and ritual than for warmth he no longer needed. The flame caught in the still air of the spring field and held without effort, untroubled by wind for the first time since he'd left the settlement. He set the copper pot to heat and worked through the last of his stores, dried meat, the remaining spices, a handful of tundra moss he'd collected at the base of the dam that morning in the automatic forager's habit of gathering what was available regardless of immediate need. It made a thin broth. It was hot, and it was made with care, and that was sufficient. He carried the pot to the edge of Balin's pool and set it on the rock rim without speaking. She looked at it from the water, the mist between them rendering hers a shape rather than detail. The bulk of her shoulders above the surface, the line of the iron collar at her throat catching the firelight in a thin orange reflection. She reached up and took the pot and drank directly from it, both hands around the base, and the firelight moved across the water in the slow, undulating patterns that firelight always made on water, regardless of where the water was or what had happened to reach it. The collar was still there. He had the cold chisel in his pack, and a fire now capable of heating the iron sufficiently to weaken the seal weld. And he had said nothing about this because the timing of it was hers to decide, not his. She would say when, or she wouldn't, and they would address it in the morning. Or she would address it herself in her own way, at a time of her choosing. And all of those were the same to him. What was done in sequence, and the sequence wasn't finished yet, and there was no useful reason to rush the parts that remained. She set the empty pot back on the rim and looked at the fire for a while. And then she looked at him across the water and the mist. The fire between them was small and steady, and it warmed the immediate air and threw its light equally in all directions without preference or distinction, touching the pool surfaces and the dark earth and the base of the vapor column rising into the cold sky above them. She reached down into the water and found the chain and lifted one link of it out of the pool and held it in the firelight, examining it with the detached attention of someone looking at an old document they'd memorized long ago and no longer needed to keep. Then she set it back in the water and looked at the fire again, and Julian fed the last piece of split wood into the flame, and the springs moved in their slow, warm circles, and the stars came out above them, one at a time, into the clearing sky.